So, what I mean to share by telling you these two sort of mechanisms for dealing with digital overwhelm is that sometimes what works for you doesn't work for another person. It doesn't work for the coworker that you have. Sometimes what works for the coworker doesn't work for you. So, what we need, I think, is to remember that digital overwhelm is not just in my head, it's not just in my chest. It's not inside me. It's in the room. We're all dealing with it.
Awekenge, this is Mental Matters, hosted by Asego Toto. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Mental Matters, the show where we tackle what truly matters, our minds, our well-being, and how we navigate life challenges together. I'm your host, Asego Toto, and today we're diving into an issue that affects millions of people worldwide, but often remains hidden behind closed doors: corporate mental health. Now, let me ask you this. Have you ever felt overwhelmed by endless deadlines? Or maybe you've struggled to find balance between climbing the career ladder and taking care of yourself? If so, you're not alone. In fact, studies show that work-related stress is one of the leading causes of mental health issues globally. And it's time we bring this conversation out into the open. So through the couple of days, we'll be actually speaking about with experts on the conversation when it comes to mental health and corporate environment. And hopefully you'll enjoy the conversation and be able to actually identify why is it so important to take care of your mental health. And yeah, I'm talking to you. So without further ado, in a world that never stops moving, it's crucial to remember productivity doesn't come at the expense of our well-being. So stay tuned because today and next couple of the next couple of days will redefining success one healthy mind at a time. Don't go anywhere. This is Mental Matters and we're just getting started. I'm quite fascinated that what made you actually be so interested on talking about such issue, especially in a workplace, whereas I believe that whereas when it comes to mental health, no one really wants to talk about it, especially when it comes to, I would say that in a workplace, whereas everyone is just trying to work it out, go into work and not ignore everything, only work and go home. So what initially drew you to actually this kind of work? And why do you believe that we need to actually look at these things and in a different eye?
Mm-hmm. Aseko, I want to make sure I understand your question. So are you asking why talk about mental health in the workplace as opposed to, I don't know, our other parts of our lives? Is that what you're asking about?
Putting emphasis on it because I believe that in most cases that we might talk about mental health one session or two and leave it out and forget to talk about it or ignore it on purpose. So why do we need to put the emphasis on it when it comes to mental health in the workplace?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not a therapist. I'm a communication scholar. So I began this investigation not by paying attention to mental health. I didn't notice it as an issue myself. But as I talked to dozens of Gen Z and millennial professionals, I was forced to pay attention to it. I was compelled to realize that mental unwellness is profoundly shaping our workplaces today. So how did I get onto this? Not because I'm a smart person, but because the people I was talking to kept bringing it up.
It has been on my side a conversation that I spoke about it, but not in depth, but it wasn't in the main conversation, and it's something I myself actually took notice because last year I was working here at Nelson Mandela University as on a side on a disability unit. So in general, when it came to talking about mental health in the workplace, it's not something that I took to heart, and I understood as in a position of an intern. You don't in some point it's a, and some and on some time you don't actually ask these questions that, oh flip, why is the culture here like this? Why is the culture neglecting mental health? I was just passing by in a way of trying to do the work and move on, trying to get an experience as I mentioned, as in an intern position. And speak about interns, it's something that through my research, doing this thing when as focusing on mental health and actually not mental health in general, like the overwhelmed of work, especially Gen Z and millennials actually go through something that you mentioned on your message is the fact that we're trying to, in a way of being in the good books of our managers.
Pardon me. Just sneeze there. Pardon me. Excuse me. Just
bless it. We're trying to be in the good books of our managers, our supervisors. So to your own research, writing a book writing a book, Digital Overwhelm, what through your research, through your findings, why did you find out that how did you see it? Why do millennials and Gen Z kept on working, knowing clearly that their mental health is at stake? And yeah.
Well, I mean, people are resilient, people are strong, and so they do what they have to do in situations that aren't perfect. What I did notice, and this was another thing, Aseko, that I learned that I didn't know before the research, Gen Z and millennial professionals were doing a better job at drawing boundaries around their lives and their work than Gen Xers like me or boomers like my parents. So I don't know why they continue to work apart from economic reasons. They need to pay tuition. They need to pay for mortgages or rent. They got to put food on the table for their kids. That's probably what's going on there. But how they did it is maybe more interesting to me. How do people keep going in circumstances that are so difficult as the early 2020s were, and, you know, as the mid 2020s sort of are now? And I think that one tactic that people used was to draw a sharper line between their life and their work. My book, Digital Overwhelm, looks at 6 coping mechanisms that people used to deal with the overwhelm of work, as you called it, especially the digital aspects of that. And so, yeah, I took a lot of notes and I processed it and digested it. And this book basically analyzes those 6 approaches to digital overwhelm, or those 6 ways of coping with digital overwhelm at work.
And it's quite fascinating because as much as you speak about the coping mechanisms, and you mentioned the boomers and you mentioned Gen Z, you mentioned millennials, and I feel like when I just finished reading Diary of CEO by Steve Bartlett, and it really gave me a different perspective. And whereas I feel like as millennials, as Gen Z, we expect to be part of, if I'm gonna work at a certain company, I want to be part of it. I want to be part of the people that make decisions. And that's where I came across a philosophy I'm quite sure that you are familiar with it. Kaizen is the Japanese philosophy that every little thing matters, whereas even the smallest idea matters. But whenever my generation and millennials don't be included, we don't see the purpose of doing that something. As you mentioned that sometimes some people continue because of economical reasons, and whereas you will see a certain individual has a remote job at the same time has a face-to-face job, and imagine during the day they do their face-to-face job and during the night they do their remote job, and
Mm-hmm.
that causes a lot of fatigue, that causes a lot of burnout, that causes a lot of anxiety, and people not actually just pushing through just to get past this day, just to get paying the studies, but having
Yeah.
money for rent. It's quite a conversation that people I'm familiar with, and or people are afraid of having. And
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned, can you in a way of elaborate on these six coping mechanisms? And I believe that it's
Mm-hmm.
something that might be actually beneficial to the
Mm-hmm.
audience that might be listening.
Oh, thank you. I hope so. Let me say first that when I read books about coping with all the technology in our work and just some of the things you just named, one major strategy that I see is to minimalize technology, to minimize technology in your work life. So, um, pare it down, simplify it, use one thing at a time. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. But my book has a different recommendation. Instead of minimalism, I recommend flexibility.
Mm,
So sometimes I just call this communicational flexibility. And I feel like I learned this from talking with Gen Z and millennial professionals because they don't have just one way of dealing with digital overwhelm. I found six at least, and there probably were more.
mm,
But I'll give you a couple of examples of these to sort of a teaser for my book, if you like, a sort of trailer for the book. So, one way that a lot of people deal with digital overwhelm is by trying to, as they put it, get everybody on the same page. And they do this by writing a really long email, 1,000-word email or something. And like, this will clear it up. This will make me feel better. This will make everybody else understand what we're doing. This will simplify our work together. That sometimes works. It has the benefit of clarity. It has the benefit of thoroughness, and you can always go back and asynchronously read it and digest it. So that's good. But some people are overwhelmed by your attempt to deal with overwhelm. The email is too long. I can't read all that. I don't have time for that. So some people then say, you know what we need here is not a really long email. We need a face-to-face conversation. So let's get on Teams or Zoom and let's talk this out. Or let's get in person, talk it out. This is sometimes called grabbing coffee or something like that. And that's also a good approach to dealing with digital overwhelm. Sometimes a conversation can really provide a lot of information that a digital text would not, or an email might not, about tone and attitude and just the posture of the other person. So there's a real good in conversation. But at the same time, if you have, let's say, deep differences from the other person, sometimes a conversation just makes those differences harder and deeper. So, what I mean to share by telling you these two sort of mechanisms for dealing with digital overwhelm is that sometimes what works for you doesn't work for another person. It doesn't work for the coworker that you have. Sometimes what works for the coworker doesn't work for you. So what we need, I think, is to remember that digital overwhelm is not just in my head. It's not just in my chest. It's not inside me. It's in the room. We're all dealing with it. And so the whatever coping mechanism we use has to be social. It has to be collective. It has to be shareable. And I think maybe the best way to approach that is to practice digital and communicational flexibility. So those are two modes that I talked about. And I also wanted to explain why I think it's important to have more than one or two modes at your beck and call.
Mm-hmm. And you spoke in terms of writing, for example, the manager writing a long email trying to settle differences, and you quite mentioned Zoom or Teams and face to face. One of the things that I'm quite sure that has another tremendous mental health, I would say, negative effect on us is screens of actually your whole day you've been in a screen writing emails, having meetings. So to my own opinion, to me, at some point that I don't fully believe in having the interactions on Zoom, actually online digitally, because at some point it's not effective enough as having a meeting face to face, because someone can just switch off their cameras and say things, and others might be seem bored of what you're saying. So your research through writing this book, how has Gen Z and millennials have seen the differences between having a meeting through Zoom and have a meeting through face to face?
It's a good question. My sense, let me think about that for a moment, Aseko. So the first thing I should say is that almost everybody liked the idea of a face-to-face conversation. Like, nobody said, ugh, face-to-face, it's terrible. Everybody liked the idea of it. But sometimes the reality of it wasn't as good as the idea of it. So I'll give you two examples. First, I'm thinking of a woman professional, works in California, or did at the time of our interview. And her bosses were insisting that, they all return to office. RTO, get back to the physical workspace. Let's get together. Let's work in person. And she talked as a woman about the ways that made a lot of sense, maybe for her male, middle-aged manager. But for her, it complicated her life quite a lot. Not just like the traffic and getting to work, but actually being at work. So the physical proximity of her boss was sometimes too close. The sight lines and angles that she had to think about when he was sort of looking over her shoulder at a screen, it felt like either she had to perform in some ways that were not particularly good for her mental wellness, or she had to actually kind of worry about the way her boss might be taking advantage of her. So, yeah, I think almost everybody I talked to said it's a good idea for us to talk in person, but the reality of it was sometimes less obviously good. And I'll just mention a second example. This is not from my research, but this is something that I encountered in the journalism of Derek Thompson for The Atlantic. Thompson noted a study that online collaboration for small teams for the longest time was much better in person than it was online. If you were in person working on a team, doing a group project in some way, the results were superior than if you were doing the same project, but doing it online. However, that has begun to shift. And it seems like humans have begun to adapt, adjust, flex. And now the results from online collaboration have at least matched, if not surpassed, those of in-person groups. So, yeah, I mentioned those two examples as ways that somewhat complicate our intuition. I share it with you, by the way. The intuition that being in person is much better. Quite frankly, I would love it if you and I were sitting in the same studio. That would be lovely. And that's a good intuition. But at the same time, there are some complexities to it. There are some ways that it's not always a good thing.
And it goes back to something that I'm reading a book by Rick Rubin and on art, whereas how ideas come into fruition, and he talks about when something new comes in within the type of art that you are doing. It's either you go with it or you swim against the current. Definitely, when you swim against the current, you will definitely won't survive. And I feel like as much as one has a certain preference, especially managers have certain preference that no, I want to meet you face to face, but at the same time, eventually your people will feel, I wouldn't say happy, I would say unhappy within the workplace, and you realize that day by day you will be losing employees. And I want to again speak on more on what you've said about the lady you're there to speaking on. And as Gen Z and Millennials, I realize that we hate being managed because every single thing that we do, our managers are on our neck. They are breathing here, and we can't do anything productive through that. And I believe the less that there is micromanagement, the more we become productive. It's something that I've seen within within myself, that when, as much as I report to a certain individual, but at the same time, when I'm doing a work that is, I would say, I'm not, I don't feel like I'm being watched. I'm more productive compared to when I'm doing the work. I realize that flip. Someone is watching me. I need to do this, and definitely comes a lot of mistakes. And it's something that I actually saw. And on your podcast, you spoke about, there was a conversation that I listened, whereas you all spoke about Mr. Beast. And funny thing is the fact that I think it was, when was it? I think Saturday, Sunday, I was listening to a podcast by Stephen Bartlett, Diary CEO, by a CEO, and he had Mr. Beast, and he spoke about player A being a player A. It's quite something fascinating, because sometimes we push ourselves hard enough from being a player C in the workplace to being a player A. And it definitely there comes a lot with burnout. So how do you suggest, through your work of doing this, and when it comes to communication, because I also believe communication is really the core of actually keeping people in the workplace, of actually creating a healthy working culture. So how do we encourage employees that are player C's into being player A's, and not in a harsh way?
Yeah. What a great question. I like that very much. How do we encourage excellence without, cultivating burnout?
Yeah.
Is that the question?
Yeah, that's the question.
That is the question in so many ways. That is the question. Yeah. It seems like every virtue has an accompanying vice, and the virtue of diligence often brings with it the vice of excessive work or anxious work. And those things can lead eventually to burnout. The three signals of burnout are that I've read about are a sense that you can no longer do your job well. You are cynical about other people, and you are exhausted. So again, I'll return to my insight in my book, which is we need flexibility. We need communicational flexibility. Don't get stuck in one mode and just keep hammering that approach to workplace culture. But instead, switch things up. If you, like you said, if you're stuck on screens all the time, like switch to the in-person, or put away the screens for a while and pull out pen and paper, notebook, and do some thinking that way. Do some writing and some drafting and designing that way. Take a walk. And if you have a meeting with someone, ask if you can meet them somewhere and go for a walk. Like sometimes those walking meetings can really open up things for working professionals. So that's my approach. It probably has shortcomings. It probably has limits.
Yeah.
But I do think that communicational flexibility is a wise way to sort of avoid burnout. In my experience, when I burn out, it's because I just keep hammering on one thing. I just keep trying to make this thing work, and I get exhausted, and I have to quit because I can't think anymore. So if we could, on the front end say, I'm not going to keep hammering on this. I'm going to work on this for 65 minutes, and then I'm going to stop, and I'm going to do something else. I think that requires some flexibility. It is hard to stop sometimes. You just want to keep at it. But if you can have the wisdom and the flexibility to say, no, this much and no more. And I think that's a pretty good way to avoid burnout.
As you were actually explaining it, and it's something that I myself go through, and especially when in a preparation of an episode like this, and through my work, and I stumbled upon something that I can't really figure out, and how I will actually structure it. And
yeah,
it's something that is quite fascinating when you say that I didn't look at it. Sometimes when you want something to work, you don't recognize burnout. You don't recognize that you have been doing this for such and such hours, and you see it by chance. Oh, blip! I've been doing this for 3 or 4 hours, and you stop. As much as you stop doing that certain thing, but at the same time you are not you 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 come across that thing in that same approach. You don't change your approach, and you don't think clear. And I believe that really works when you spoke about taking a meeting while you're working and actually writing things down instead of always facing the screen. And it's something big that you spoke about when you spoke about flexible communication. One of the things that I'm quite sure about, I'm quite fascinated when it comes to communication, is the fact that sometimes you might say something, and a certain people on the other hand, on the other hand, doesn't take the way that you spoke, you intentionally you intended to be taken. So how do you actually maneuver that? How do you actually, in a way of saying that, of realizing that, or flip, if I'm going to write this, or if I'm going to say this, I am eventually as someone that has different type of stuff. Whereas if it's your boomers, your millennials, your Gen Z, how do I create that inclusive way of communication? It's a pity that I believe that we are left with 3 minutes, and I would have have liked to have this case of conversation more, because it's quite a fascinating conversation. And on top of that, in terms of your answers, they are not just answers that one's actually general knowledge. I would say it's something that when you answer me, I have to think about it, and I have to listen carefully. Sorry about that. No problem. No problem. And it's something that is quite fascinating. And I had a great experience in terms of having this conversation, and having this conversation in a different perspective. Yeah. And especially when it comes to mental health, you don't hear a lot about people speaking about these issues, especially when it comes to mental health. Thank you so much, Greg, and really appreciate with you. And definitely will let you know when the episode is out, because in all honesty, I have a lot of actually episodes that have lined up for listening. So that's a lot. So I will definitely let you know when the episode is out. Definitely will include your book on the description on show notes, and also your podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you so much. Thanks so much for your time.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.